Hi everyone, this is the introduction to the muscular system. So when most people think of the muscular system, they immediately think of the skeletal muscles, which are color-coded here on the anterior surface and the posterior surface of a typical human body. But actually there's more to the muscular system than that. So the essential question that we have today is what types of muscles are in the body? We'll talk about the function of muscles and then the three types of muscles: smooth, cardiac, and skeletal muscle. And we'll end with a brief discussion of a disease or disorder called muscular dystrophy. Here's the vocabulary that you should be able to use to answer this essential question by the end of this lecture. So what are the functions of muscles? Well, first, they produce movement, meaning when muscles contract, they're going to pull your bones into position, or they're going to, push food through the digestive canal, things like that. Muscles enable you to maintain posture, and they also allow you to change posture and retain balance even when you do change posture. Particularly when you sit upright or when you are standing upright, then you have to constantly contract muscles, whether you're aware of it or not, to fight the downward pull of gravity. Muscles also stabilize joints. So here you can see this is a joint between the humerus and the radius and ulna of your lower arm. And this is the bicep muscle, and you can see that there's a tendon right here that is attaching the bicep to and anchoring it, inserting it right here at the radius of your lower arm. And so that allows the joint to stabilize so that you can control the movement of the bones at that joint. And then last of all, muscles generate heat. So as your muscles contract, they're going to burn ATP, and part of the energy that's in the ATP molecule will then be released as heat. That allows your body to maintain normal temperature, and it's the main reason why you shiver when it gets cold. It's because those muscles that contract to enable you to shiver are generating heat during that process. And that, of course, allows you to maintain homeostatic body temperature. So here are the three types of muscles that you'll find in the body. The first is the cardiac muscle. It looks like this. The purple thing in the middle is the nucleus. So this is one cardiac muscle cell. You'll notice that it's striped, it's striated. It does have a nucleus. And you'll also notice that the muscle cells are branched off. So you can see a branch here. You can see another branch here. Over here, this is a skeletal muscle. These attach to bones. And the skeletal muscles are also striped. But what's weird about this is it actually has many nuclei. And so in this model, you're just shown 3 nuclei, but actually you would expect a lot more nuclei, dozens, hundreds, possibly more, depending on the size of the muscle. And then last of all, in places like your stomach or in other hollow visceral organs like your esophagus, your intestines, where it's hollow on the inside and it's one of your vital organs, these are lined by smooth muscle cells, which are shaped like spindles. Notice that they are not striated or striped the way that the other two types are, and they only have one nucleus in the center. We're going to start with smooth muscle. So as I said before, smooth muscles have no striations, so they are not striped. So here you can see a model of a smooth muscle cell. They're spindle shaped. Spindle meaning, you know that thing, I'm not a weaver, but if I was, weavers use spindles to weave thread yarn on looms to make things like rugs and mattresses and whatnot. Maybe you know the story of Sleeping Beauty, and she pricked her finger on a spindle. So these are shaped like spindles, and they have a single nucleus, or what we say they're mononucleate, mono meaning one. So they're mononucleate cells. They contract involuntarily, meaning you cannot control the contraction of muscles in your stomach or the contraction of muscles in your intestines. They happen involuntarily. And then they're found mainly in the walls of hollow organs. So here would be, for example, an intestinal cross-section where you can see these are the walls of the intestine here, and then this would be the interior lumen of the intestine with all of these cells sticking out like that. And so these smooth muscle cells form a ring that allows the interior lumen to expand if food is passing through, or to contract in order to push the food to the next part of the intestine. Here you can see a cross-sectional view of the cell. So if we cut it, you know, like horizontally or crosswise, then this is what they would look like. But if you looked at them lengthwise, this is what they would look like. Next, let's discuss cardiac muscle. So these have striations, which you can see in this model here, and here's a cross-sectional view of these cardiac cells. Notice that each cell typically only has one nucleus. That's not always true, but typically they are true. So here is one cardiac muscle cell. Here is another cardiac muscle cell. And then in between the two, there's this intercalated disc. So these are clearly visible under a microscope. And once again, they're called intercalated discs. Cardiac muscle is also involuntary in its contraction. You cannot control how quickly or slowly your heart beats, and you will only find cardiac muscle in the heart. You'll notice, by the way, that the cardiac muscle forms these bundles that basically wrap around the four chambers of the heart, and when the cardiac muscle squeezes, they squeeze in or they contract in synchronization with each other, and so that allows blood to be pushed rhythmically through your heart and through all of the blood vessels in your body. We're going to spend the majority of our time discussing skeletal muscle. I don't know what this is. Oh, there we go. Okay, so skeletal muscle. Remember that they typically are attached to bones by tendons. They're multinucleate, meaning that here you just have one cross-section of a skeletal muscle cell. So this is a single cell here. And you can see that the nucleus is right there like just under the cell membrane, pushed up against the cell membrane because of all of the muscle fibers inside. But this would not be the only nucleus that you would see in the muscle fiber. You would see multiple nuclei all along its length. And the reason is, as the muscle cells are developing when you're a fetus, they fuse together. So instead of being a string of muscle cells all in a row, they become one single muscle fiber with many, many nuclei. As we said before, they're striated, so you can see the striations here, 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 and then once again you can see these vertical striations in this microscope image of a skeletal muscle. What makes skeletal muscle different from the other types is they're voluntary. So you can control how you contract skeletal muscles, and that allows you to do things like run or pick up a pen and write, things like that. Although you also have some involuntary control of your skeletal muscle, and we'll discuss that when we get to the nervous system. And then cells are surrounded and bundled by connective tissue, which we'll see on the next slide. One thing I want you to notice, this whole model that we have here is just one single muscle cell. It's called a muscle fiber. But you'll notice that inside of it you have multiple muscle, like smaller fibers that we call myofibrils, where the prefix myo means muscle. And then these myofibrils are composed of even smaller filaments called myofilaments. So this is at the molecular level over here on the right of this model. And the two types of myofilaments, which you're going to learn about more in our next lecture, are called actin and myosin. So here you've got a myofibril, that's the one fiber. A bunch of them are found in a muscle fiber. So this is a single cell, and it has many nuclei. And you can see the nuclei here and here. And then a bunch of muscle cells will form a bunch called a fascicle. And then a bunch of fascicles are wrapped together to make a muscle. So once again, this is one fiber inside a muscle fiber. One fibril inside a muscle fiber. So this is the cell. Many nuclei. A bunch of these cells bundled together make up a fascicle, and then a bunch of fascicles bundled together make up a muscle. And all of these myofibrils inside of these muscle fibers, which are inside of these fascicles, they all contract synchronously in a coordinated fashion to allow the entire muscle to contract and then relax as one. Right. So just to break that down again, once again, a muscle fiber is just one single muscle cell. And that's really weird because normally we think of cells as like these round shapes, but in this case they're not. They're these elongated fibers that stretch the entire length of the muscle. Now, the muscle fiber is wrapped by a connective tissue membrane called an endomysium. The endo meaning inside, right? Mysium or myo meaning muscle. And so there would be an endomysium wrapping this fiber and an endomysium wrapping each of these muscle fibers inside this fascicle. And then here, this model is showing a leader line to that white connective tissue that's wrapping around each of those muscle fibers right here. Okay, once again, if you have a bunch of these muscle fibers, which once again are cells, you have a bunch of them, you bundle them together, that's called a fascicle. And the fascicle is wrapped by this white connective tissue called the perimysium. Peri meaning around. Think of like the word perimeter in geometry, right? Peri means around. Myo means muscle. So it's the white connective tissue that wraps around a fascicle. So if you have a bunch of these fascicles, that's called a muscle. And you have an epimysium, which is, once again, just connective tissue that wraps around the entire muscle. And then on top of that, there would be yet another layer of connective tissue that protects the entire muscle called the fascia, which would be outside the epimysium. And the fascia is not labeled here in this model, but just you would see it if we were doing a dissection. The fascia would be that layer that you would first pull off if we were dissecting a muscle. One thing I want to draw your attention to, this epimysium here is going to blend into what we call a tendon. So that's that connective tissue there that basically anchors the muscle to the bone. Sometimes you'll see it as a sheet. So if you were looking at the breastbone, for example, the muscles, like your pectoral muscles, would stretch and anchor to the muscles of your clavicle, your sternum, your rib cage. They'd connect in these sheets that are called aponeuroses. So yeah, so that's that. Okay, so this is unlabeled. You'll see this model again when we meet together in class. But to go from smallest to largest, I want you to try to take the words from this slide and see if you can use them with this model. And if you can, that means that you've mastered the gross anatomy of skeletal muscle. And when you're ready, you can unpause the video and I will go over the answers with you. All right, you guys, these are myofilaments, so actin and myosin. So these are the molecules that are inside this muscle fiber, which is a cell. I'm sorry, this is a myofibril, my bad. This is a myofibril. Take a bunch of these myofibrils and bundle them up, and that is going to be wrapped around with an endomysium. And so this whole structure here is one muscle cell. What's not pictured are the nuclei that would be part of this. Now take a bunch of these muscle cells and bundle them up and wrap them up in perimysium. Hi, Timo. And that would be a muscle fiber, which is the cell. And then take, I'm sorry, this is a fascicle. My bad. This is the muscle fiber. Timo, shh, I'm recording a lecture. Okay, so this is a muscle cell. Bundle them up together. That's a fascicle. Take a bunch of these fascicles and then wrap them in epimysium, epi meaning on the top or on the surface. Wrap them in epimysium and attach them with a tendon to a bone, and there you go. That's a skeletal muscle. Okay, so just to recap, here are the three types of muscles. We've got skeletal muscles. You know, I should have asked you to try to figure out which is which. So just take a few seconds, make sure you know the names of all three types. And here we go. So this is skeletal muscle. These are muscles that are attached to bones, and they look like these. So they are not branched. They are striated, meaning they have those vertical stripes. They're multinucleate, meaning they have multiple nuclei in each of these single cells, and they are voluntary. You can control the contraction of these muscles a great deal of the time. The next type is cardiac muscle, which are found in the walls of the heart. These are striated as well, so you can see the vertical striping. They are typically mononucleate, so they tend to only have one visible nucleus in between the intercalated discs that join one muscle cell to an adjacent muscle cell. And they are involuntary. You cannot control their contractions. And last of all, you have the smooth muscle cells, which are found in hollow organs like the stomach, the esophagus, the intestines. They are not striated. They are mononucleate, only one nucleus. They tend to be spindle-shaped, and they are involuntary. You cannot control their contractions. Okay, you'll notice we spent the majority of this lecture on skeletal muscle, and that's because skeletal muscle has a very complicated set of tasks to do. One thing that can happen during development is if you have genetic mutations, then you can end up with a disorder called muscular dystrophy, which results in the degeneration of voluntary and later on involuntary muscles. There are many different, like 9 different types of muscular dystrophy, but they are all genetic, meaning you will get muscular dystrophy because you have a mutation in your DNA that has been passed down to you from your parents. And the most common and most serious type is Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is X-linked. It's carried on the X chromosome, which means that almost all kids with Duchenne muscular dystrophy are boys. It's typically diagnosed between the ages of 2 to 6, and here's why. It's because in the beginning, well, first let's get to what muscular dystrophy actually is caused by. And so the gene that has the mutation would encode a protein called dystrophin. And dystrophin is one of a bunch of different proteins that all are interdependent, so they work together. They're found on the membrane that surrounds each muscle fiber, and they help basically to keep muscles working properly. So here would be the membrane. Just imagine underneath this would be all of the muscle, the myofibrils that make up the muscle fiber. And dystrophin is this orange spaghetti-like protein here that basically connects to these other ones to ensure that the muscle is able to contract. When the dystrophin is absent, what happens is as the child first starts to grow up, they seem active, they appear normal, they're able to go from just rolling around to crawling, and then from crawling to pulling themselves up and from walking to running. But sometime right around maybe the 2nd year of life, while other kids are getting bigger and stronger, kids with muscular dystrophy are becoming more clumsy, and they begin to fall more as their muscles start to weaken. And the first muscles that weaken are around the hips, the pelvis, the thighs, the shoulders. And then as they grow up, the disorder then starts to degrade muscles in their arms, legs, chest, neck, head, face. Even the muscles around their eyes, they may no longer be able to control their eye movements. Even the muscles in their mouth and their tongue, they may no longer be able to hold their tongue inside of their mouth. They may no longer be able to contract the muscles of their neck, so they may no longer be able to hold their neck up straight. So their head might fall to the side. And by the time they're in their early teens, like 14, 15, the disorder attacks involuntary muscles like their heart, their respiratory muscles, and this eventually would lead to death. The longest I've ever heard of anyone with Duchenne muscular dystrophy living was into their 20s. So on that sad note, here are your key takeaways. Muscles produce movement, maintain posture, stabilize joints, and generate heat. And smooth muscles are found in the walls of hollow visceral organs. Smooth muscle cells are mononucleate and spindle-shaped, and they contract involuntarily. The second type, cardiac muscle, is found in the heart. They're mononucleate, striated, and branched, and they contract involuntarily. And last of all, the skeletal muscles are attached to bones. They're multinucleate and striated, and they're mostly voluntary. And you can have hereditary gene mutations that can cause muscular dystrophies that cause muscles to degenerate as patients age. So that was an introduction to the skeletal system and to the gross structure of skeletal muscle. I meant to say the musculatory system. Take a few seconds, see if you can answer this essential question using all of these vocabulary, and if you can, that means you have mastered this topic.